Then I approached him and I asked him if he wanted something to drink. He didn't answer me. He nodded his head. I went down to the basement. He followed me to the basement. And whatever happened there, I choked him. It was something that just happened like quick. I don't know why I did it. I don't know why it happened.
As you talk about it, are you surprised?
I don't even know if it happened. I never saw his face.
And we are live. Once again, this is the Solvable Mysteries Podcast, episode number 12. My name is Juras. As usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Glenn. How are you feeling, man?
Hi, doing okay. It's a nice, semi-cool morning here in Los Angeles.
Cool. Today's case is the disappearance of Etan Patz. So, without any further ado, Etan Khalil Patz was an American boy who was 6 years old on May 25th, 1979, when he disappeared on his way to his school bus stop in the Soho neighborhood of Lower Manhattan. His disappearance helped launch the missing children's movement, which included new legislation and new methods for tracking down missing children. Several years after he disappeared, essentially, Patz was one of the first children to be profiled on the photo on a milk carton campaigns of the early 80s, and in 1983, even President Ronald Reagan designated May 25th, the official anniversary of Etan's disappearance, as National Missing Children's Day in the United States. So, this case, back in the late 70s, I believe this was the most famous, most talked about missing child case in America, don't you think?
Yeah, it's really fascinating reading the research on this because it's so I was born in 1976 and this kid was born in 1972, I believe. And it's interesting to like it's kind of like this kid was growing up around the same time I did, and then in Lithuania, do you guys do the photos in the milk carton thing?
No. We do.
Okay.
I think it's because like Lithuania is not that big, so there's no real need for that here. But by the way, do you still do that in America?
It's a good question. I feel like the milk I buy is from Costco and it's like boxed, and I feel like they don't do it as much anymore. There may have been some point where they decided in some ways it was hurting more than helping. I don't know. It gets a little weird because you're like, well, if this person's a runaway, maybe they're running away from abuse, and there's just like sometimes it can get complicated. But it is interesting to see that this was one of the first cases, wasn't it, in the research, that this is almost what started the face in the milk carton thing here in the U.S. Yeah, it was very much part of growing up in the 80s. I definitely remember seeing those faces, and it's interesting to see that this was the case that kicked it off, in part because I guess his father was a professional photographer. So some of these photos, like, it's funny, like you and I think will start to make a habit out of noticing like really good photos from before the digital era, right? Yeah, so because it was so much harder. Like you didn't even know if you had a good photo because film was expensive. So every reel of film is like $6, and you got to get developed, and you don't get to see it till prints are made.
Exactly.
Or at least, negatives are done. Anyway, so they had a lot of good photos to use, and they're like, hey, let's throw it up on milk cartons, and that's maybe a way.
Right. So these are, Etan's parents, by the way, Stanley and Julie Patz. So as you mentioned before, Stanley was a professional photographer at the time of Etan's disappearance, and I believe he also, continued his work after Etan's disappearance. So as you can see, like some of these pictures, they are really like high quality pictures. Like, most of the missing person cases, especially like young child cases from the 80s and even 90s, they usually don't even have good quality pictures. Hence, Michael Negrit's case, where we literally couldn't find a single high resolution picture of him, even though the case was still ongoing and people are still trying to find the man. So, it's interesting. But yeah, as you've mentioned before, I guess in part this is why this case was so famous back in the late 70s, because when they actually had good quality pictures of the kid, right?
Yeah, and then it started a couple of things apparently, because the case was so prominent, and the child was never found, by the way. There's some legal developments later that we'll discuss, but Etan is still technically missing, though presumed dead. He was such the case was so big in media that I think President Reagan declared a national missing children's day
Yeah, he did
on his behalf. It required, it got a lot of coverage, so here's one thing that was, once again, I'd be really curious, Juras, to see how this compares to how you grew up in Lithuania and how you were taught to interact with like other adults, especially strangers as a child. But I can say growing up, like I definitely got my share of kind of propaganda through media. So through like government, advertisements, and through, TV shows and public service announcements and things like that you had to really be careful about strangers, and, like stranger danger, that rhymes in English. Like just that there was some perceived danger from a stranger, that like something might happen to you. And I think this was coming out of a period of awareness where I think, to be fair, culture was pretty naive before that. So I think there was a period, let's say from the 1950s and before in America, where people in America didn't even like to talk about sex and procreation and reproduction. And there were a lot of like things, and never mind things like sexuality or alternative ways of living or viewing yourself. So I think that unfortunately, because of that, there probably was some high amount of violation of, like, let's say children had things happen to them that either wasn't discussed or felt was sort of written off as like, oh, we don't know what happened to that kid, he just suddenly disappeared, like in the case of Etan. But you also had things that sort of, like you go look at what's happened with the church in the United States legally, and Boy Scouts as well. A whole bunch of things have come out about adults doing things to children. Sometimes the adults know the children, sometimes they don't. But I think this is like sort of a dawning age of like America losing its innocence. So like stranger danger is interesting, because now there's like kind of a movement to move away from stranger danger. This is part of the research where they're like, well,
is there what?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, right? Because you think, like, especially with the news and the mass shootings and things going on, you would think there's even more of a danger from strangers,
exactly,
and I think
right?
that's the case. But there's like sort of a back and forth between like parenting styles and like almost like parenting philosophy. So
Why would you move away from that like that? That's
yeah,
weird.
well, so I'm glad you said that, because that's like part of it. I think I get a little frustrated with the counter reaction. So the counter reaction is, oh, you're making children too paranoid. You're teaching them to be very distrustful. Maybe you're teaching them to be bad citizens in a way, because you're teaching them to like maybe harbor prejudices against people that don't look like you, or people that are from a different socioeconomic class. It's sort of like you're predisposing them to be prejudiced against, let's say, that homeless guy wandering up the block. Well, okay, that's true. And then they pointed to other statistics. So like if you look up the Wikipedia on this, turns out that like, you know, besides if you exclude runaways, which is a big chunk of missing children, you know, just running out of their home for whatever reason, you have people that are abducted by their own parent. So maybe you have like in many cases it's a non-custodial father. It can also be a mother. We see this all the time in California. We'll have what's called an Amber Alert. Your phone will go off with a little alert, and it'll tell you to be on the lookout for a certain car with a certain license plate. And that's you know, in many cases a non-custodial. You know, like the parents split up, and they're fighting over the kids now, almost like that. Like last week when we were talking about the case with Kieran.
Kieran Horman, right? Yeah, episode number 9, right?
Yeah, where Kieran's stepsister, the parents were having a custody battle. So yeah, sometimes what happens is one of the parents loses, and they illegally abduct their own children and take them across state or federal lines. So yeah, that's what people point to, and they say, you know, technically when you look at the amount of kids injured, like randomly injured or killed by a stranger, the odds are like 1 in 10,000. And I don't know. I mean, Juras, what do you think about that? 1 in 10,000. Does that sound like a good high number, a low number? How do you feel about that?
In terms of what, like, I've actually even like lost track a little bit, right? Like,
right. Well, I mean, okay, yeah. So if someone told you,
right?
Okay, so like let's pretend first you're not a parent, which you're not a parent currently.
Yeah.
So if someone told you had a 1 in 10,000 chance of something bad happening, and that bad happening thing was like your foot getting broken, you have a 1 in 10,000 chance that when you walk out the door today, something's going to happen. You know, a car, bowling ball,
of
right?
course, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, would you write that off as like not a huge
risk?
Yeah.
Yeah, like, you know, personally, like whenever I go out, like, I don't really care for my own well-being enough. I would say, like, I'm, you know, I tend to do some reckless things sometimes, you know, especially on the weekend. But you know, yeah, that makes sense. Like, that's the thing for me. Like, if I had kids right now, like, I even think to myself, like, man, I wouldn't want them, you know, to do the things that, you know, I do, like, or stuff like that. Like, I would definitely want them to, you know, to be more safe, or like, you know, make maybe like some sort of like safer decisions. But yeah, I mean,
right. So
that
I'm glad you said that, because it's sort of like it really depends on what you're risking, right? So
exactly,
you know, getting back to stranger danger and people that criticize, like, well, you're causing all this fear for an abnormally tiny amount of risk. Well, I'd like to point at a case like this, or, you know, what happened to what we presume happened to John Benet Ramsey, or, you know, I'll even give some recent examples of things that happened with strangers just here in recent news. So, think about that. Like, okay, 1 in 10,000 is pretty low odds. I mean, probably you have a higher chance of dying in an auto accident when you drive to work or something like that. But usually, you know, I think a lot of times when people think of the odds, they think of maybe something that can be replaced, or something where, you know, like, you know, even if you broke your foot's going to heal. But like, here's the thing. I think when you're, like you said, when you're parenting, you want to try to eliminate risks, and like a 1 in 10,000 chance of losing your child and maybe like your whole point of living, like your whole life is really focused on, at this point in my life, is focused on my child. So like, to lose all of that, it's not really worth it. Like, I'm not going to be glad that I saved 5 minutes to get more coffee, you know, because I took that risk. It's one of those things where I think sometimes the people that try to calculate risk, like, you're not really weighing the odds appropriately.
Exactly,
because you're not weighing
right.
the penalty. So case in point, it turned out that the context here was that Etan was
I believe his name is
sorry, Etan.
Etan, right?
I gotta get out of my mouth right. Yeah, so Aiden was, he's a little boy becoming a big boy.
He was
like
6.
we like to say
He was
as a
6,
parent. He
right?
was 6. Yeah, and certainly 6-year-olds like to feel like a big boy or a big girl, depending what they are. So this was, I think, during an era where parents still felt pretty safe. Late 70s, and empowering their child and saying, hey, especially living in New York City, you're gonna have to learn to use the subway and do, use the bus and do all these other things. And you do see a lot, especially back then. For sure, you saw a lot of kids that would ride the subway by themselves, because they had to for school.
Exactly, right?
Yeah,
Even to this day,
cool.
like even in places like Lithuania, not necessarily New York, you still have to take the bus halfway across the city. There's no other way for kids to get around here. It's not like you're gonna be driving a car at 14, or 13 or something like that. So you obviously need to learn how to do those things. I mean, at six though, I remember like when I was 6, my grandmother used to take me to school. We would go to the bus and stuff like that. But at around 8 years of age, I started doing that on my own. So I think 6 is, in my opinion, in a place like New York of all places, maybe slightly too early to let the kid walk around on his own. But right, like 6 to me seems a little too early. Maybe 8 is the appropriate time, right?
Yeah, I agree. It seems like the parents are being a little bit progressive with their schedule of
exactly right
of getting him. I'm not really clear on whether he had other siblings or not. In this picture you're showing me, I'm not sure if those are his siblings or cousins.
Neither do I, but I know that's Julie, right? That's definitely Julie. So
that's the mother. The only reason I wonder is, especially if he had older siblings, then that kind of it's always hardest on the oldest. The oldest gets to do everything slower than the kids after them. So I was the oldest in my family, and I was probably whatever the kind of cutoff line was in my parents' mind for doing certain things, that was predicated on basically my performance at that age, on whether my sisters would get to do it earlier or later. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Definitely, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering if that was the case for him. Maybe he had an older sibling or older cousin, and they're like, oh yeah, he's been going, going to the bus by himself for 3 years already since he was 5.
Right. I mean, I didn't find any information on that, but I mean, so basically, right. Just to give our audience a little bit of context, sort of bookmarked the 2 main, I guess, points to this case on the Google Earth. So right, so the distance, just because we were talking a lot about this Etan's walk to the bus stop, I think the audience definitely needs to see the distance that was supposed of being walked by Etan. So it was around, I did a calculation prior to recording this podcast, so it was around 200 meters, right? So I mean, it's not that far.
It's really close,
right? It wasn't Etan had to traverse multiple blocks. It was just I believe 2 blocks, right? This and this, and so he was supposed to reach this area right here. This used to be the place where the bus stop in the late 70s was located for this particular street. And the thing is, Etan's mother, Julie Patz, she actually could, because they lived in this apartment building right here, she actually could see, she couldn't see the bus stop because, this corner sort of blocked her angle a little bit, but she could definitely see kids from the surrounding areas moving towards the bus stop. So I guess it would make sense. Maybe the parents that they were sort of busy, and they just sort of decided, Etan, I think you're a big boy now. You could sort of make this trip on your own, right? So and maybe she thought I will definitely look. I will see him walking down to the bus stop from the balcony or something like that, right? So it wasn't as crazy as it would seem. Like it wasn't like a Home Alone situation where this is, right, where's this little boy is like all on his own, like in New York City. So yeah, so it wasn't that
Yeah.
far. Like that's the point that I'm making, right?
Yeah, it seems like if you were a parent and you were maybe slightly progressive in terms of like maybe your peers, maybe the other parents let their kids do this, and you look outside, like you said, and there's kids milling around everywhere, getting on and off the bus, and I don't really know what the situation is with New York for school buses. So I'm assuming he was using a public bus because New York has so much traffic that they just might decide like, hey, like in most cases you should just use public transportation.
I mean, maybe back in the 70s they had those, right? I mean, who knows, right? I didn't really
Hard to tell.
yeah, I can't tell either.
But yeah, so like you said, I mean, so just do the mental calculus of the mom and dad. They're like, hey, he just goes down to the end of the block basically to jump on a bus. He's on the bus, and then presumably the bus driver and or other adults are sort of mentally keeping tabs. I mean, I certainly, if you're riding on the bus, like you wouldn't put up with someone abusing a child or doing something that you saw. And then he gets to school, he gets off, and he jumps right into school. And so from the parents' point of view, it seems relatively safe. Here's the problem is, we talked about stranger danger. Well, New York is a city with a lot of people,
a lot of strangers.
A lot of strangers. Right? Yeah. Next, so like I want to, and before anyone jumps down our throat with there's a lot of strangers, but most of them are normal. That's true. But all it takes is one disturbed individual, unfortunately, to ruin your day, and I think that gets amplified in a city where there's just so many more people in an environment that has a lot of negative externalities. There's a lot of things about living in a big city like New York that could probably make you mentally ill, or make you more sad, or more depressed, or more drug addicted, etc. It's a very very busy city. So I mentioned this because there's a couple cases I want to mention really quick. They're not mysteries. They've been pretty much solved, but they give good examples of specifically in this area. Yeah. So one was recent. This happened in the past month. There was a little boy who was just standing in front of I think his house with the rest of his family, and a homeless guy comes walking down the street. I don't think they even know him. I think maybe they've seen him around. It's been someone who's been a nuisance, and this homeless guy picks up this like 4 or 5 year old kid, complete stranger, and smashes him to the ground. Smashes him like a professional wrestler would smash somebody in the ring. And the kid almost died. The kid is still in the hospital. He's in serious condition. He was in critical condition.
Yeah, did this happen like around the same general area? Kid? In New York? In New York?
I'm not sure. Unfortunately, I don't know my New York geography that well.
But it was in New York, right?
Yeah, it was for sure New York. It was, a lot of these neighborhoods are sort of like mixed enclaves of different groups of people. So that actually points to the second example. So like that was one example. Once again, this was some kid that was used to living in New York, had no reason to think that a homeless person would walk up and smash him to the ground, yet that actually happened. So I mean, as a parent, that's horrifying, right?
Definitely. I mean, to that point, New York has a lot of different like areas, like obviously like areas like Manhattan, I'm assuming are a little bit more safer, right, than other areas, like if for say like the Bronx or South Side or Queens or anything like that. That's those areas like have a bad rep. But back in the day, this just to sort of paint a better picture here, like this happened in Manhattan. So
here's the weird thing. Yeah. That's good logic, and certainly it's true that like Manhattan should have a lower level of crime.
Or like a higher level, like security, right? That would make sense, right?
It should, but I think because New York is such an easily accessible city, So New York and other major American cities actually had a big crime wave problem. So coming out of World War II and peaking essentially in the late 60s or early 70s, but in terms of homicide rate, actually crime didn't peak until like the 80s and 90s in many American cities. We had a rising crime rate problem. So even places like Manhattan had crime rates that were like, in some cases, some classifications like robberies and homicides and things like that, or thefts, actually several times much worse than today. Like today, New York City is a far safer city than it was when
back in the 70s, yeah.
Yeah, back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, crime was just ridiculous. You would actually
right.
It was actually not uncommon to get mugged, even in Manhattan. It was to the point where it was almost a joke, but like a sad joke.
I mean,
so,
it would make sense because people in Manhattan, they usually had a lot more money than, for say, people in Bronx on average, right?
Yeah.
So it would make sense that people would go out and try to rob people from the richer areas.
Yeah.
Right?
So there's even that context. You would think nobody would really want to rob a little kid, but you can't put it past anybody to do something horrible, I guess. And here's another example. This was from a little longer ago. It's within the past 10 years. Also in New York, you have some parts of New York that have different ethnic communities. In this case, it was the Hasidic Jewish community. So it was a similar situation where it was like a kid about Etan's age. And once again, it was someone where it was going to be his first time. Like, gosh, this seems to happen enough that it becomes news stories. It was going to be his first time walking to school and back. I think like the school was in the neighborhood, but it was a couple blocks away. So it was maybe 400, 500 meters, something like that. And they told him, they said, look, you're really young. If you get lost, what you need to do is just ask somebody from our community. And by our community, they meant anybody that was Hasidic, wearing the hat and the beard and everything. It's very, very, very visually distinctive. So because they didn't really trust, it was in one of those neighborhoods that was like either Bronx or someplace like that, where like there were other neighborhoods of other ethnic communities where they didn't really know each other. There's a lot of distrust, mutual distrust. So that's, I guess, the stranger danger part kind of hurting us. Well, here was the interesting part about this case with this kid, and once again, it shows you what can happen in New York City with strangers. Was this kid did get lost, and he went, instead of going just one more block and going to go talk to the people not from his community at like the 7-Eleven or the neighborhood bodega, and I think honestly anybody would have helped a lost little kid, right? Who doesn't want to help a lost little kid? Well, he asked somebody from his community, a stranger, but he thought not a stranger because he's from my community. Turned out it was a wacko. Turned out it was a wacko that abducted him and killed him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, it was just completely out of the blue. Once again, something that is so unexpected, especially from within the community. But unfortunately, he asked the wrong stranger. Now, before we move on with the case, one thing I want to call out is there's a famous book called The Gift of Fear. I don't remember the author's name, but one of the things he mentions that you should tell your child is, because so many of these kind of like random abduction crimes, and let's just face it, a lot of crimes against children and minors are perpetrated by men. That doesn't mean women don't do other forms of child abuse, but
exactly,
a lot of, I'm talking about a lot of kind of the icky children's crimes are male associated. The advice he says to give to children, at least here in America, is like you would think, go, if you're lost, go find a police officer. He says no, because security guards who have been implicated in enough of these kind of crimes that like it becomes a problem, because they kind of have a false badge of authority. Like a security guard has not been screened the way, at least in this country, has been screened the way a police officer has. And in theory, depending on the city, the police agency screened the candidate pretty well before they give them a badge. But security guard can be anybody almost. So they say really what you should do is you should tell your child to go find a woman, because a woman is much more likely to be safe, and to kind of have maybe just a stereotype here, a little bit of like motherly concern and empathy and be less likely to abduct your child.
I mean, it would make sense, definitely, right? Even if I remember like being a little kid and if I ever like ran into some sort of a trouble or get lost, like I would tend to ask help from like a woman per se, right? I mean, that would seem like a more rational move, right? So anyways, like moving with the story, right? So, Etan Patz, right? So he disappears, right, in 79. So for a while, from what I've gathered, nothing really came about, right? Up until, let me just check my notes real quick. Right, so up until 1985, nothing really came about, but on 1985, Stewart R. Grabois, who was assistant United States attorney, he pretty much identified Jose Antonio Ramos, a convicted child sexual abuser who had been a friend of Etan's former babysitter, as the primary suspect. So let me just quickly find a picture of Jose. Right, so this is the guy. Basically, he was arrested for multiple child sexual abuses, even prior to his to this accusation. So right, a few more pictures. Right, so this is the guy right here. He does, from the pictures, he definitely seemed like not the type of person you would want your kid to ask for help, right? Yeah,
it's a stereotype a little bit. Yeah, the beard,
especially right now, because these are like more recent pictures right here. So the guy definitely looks like he's not even trying to hide or pretend, because obviously I believe he's serving a long sentence. I haven't really looked into the length of his sentence. I believe he's still incarcerated. Right, so this guy obviously looks like a bad Santa, a Santa from hell, a little bit, or something like that. Right, so for the longest time, so this guy was the main suspect, right? So Jose.
Yeah. The Patz family even knew him or knew of him, and I guess he was in the neighborhood, and yeah, he had all these problems. He says it doesn't really give context for when he did this, but it says in the Wikipedia thing, it says here, Ramos even drew a map of Etan's school bus route, indicating he knew that Etan's bus stop was the third one on the route. Though to be safe, to be frank, probably that's the bus stop for a bunch of kids in the neighborhood that he's been looking at.
Exactly. He has probably been doing his research. I mean, yeah. So this guy is definitely messed up in his own way. So yeah, so for the longest time he has been accused. However, the interesting part, he has denied, right? He has denied any sort of allegations against him, right? So
yeah,
it's weird, right?
It's the murder part, I think, that he's worried about, because it sounds like
right, yeah.
He's admitted to other child crimes. Either, I don't know if he's admitted to the authorities, but it sounds like he's admitted to everyone else that ever talked to him about doing some of these horrible things to other children, but not killing them, just stopping.
And at the same time, Ramos stated that on the day when Etan disappeared, he had taken a young boy back to his apartment to rape him. And Ramos said that he was 90% sure it was the boy whom he later saw on television being Etan Patz, because he was all over the TV back then. And it was... so however, Ramos did not use Etan's name. He never sort of, in his confessions, he never really mentioned Etan. So maybe that's because he, if he was raping a child or something like that, he wouldn't be interested in their names, I guess, or at least this guy was probably not into that. And he also claimed that he had put the boy that he raped on the night of Etan's disappearance on his subway. So he did not admit to killing anyone, right? And he didn't even admit to raping Etan. The only thing he stated that he was 90% sure that the boy he raped on that day, in '79 was Etan. So, but he wasn't sure 100%. So, right, I believe he was. Back in the day, he was admitting to everything, right? So I think that was the case. He was admitting to whatever picture they showed him of whatever child. He was like, "Yep, I raped him and I raped her," and so on and so forth. So he was, the credibility of his statements are definitely a little, shaky, to say the least, right? He was, he seemed like a crazy man, right?
That's where it gets really murky, and I guess where it gets really frustrating with this case. This is the first time we run into this, but we'll run into it again. Is we are dependent on very unreliable people who are, interacting with their environment unreliably. They don't want to obey society's rules. They don't even seem to want to obey our rules about telling the truth or how to construe reality,
I mean,
which we'll see later.
Yeah, I mean, I will quickly interrupt you. We even ran into the same situation in the John Benet case, where like we had that guy who claimed that he had raped and killed John Benet, but it turned out that he did not. Like, I don't really remember for what reason. I believe they couldn't match his DNA or something like that. But it seemed like that guy in the John Benet case was also just your casual, random, child abuser who sort of like for some reason just starts admitting to every single case, right? I mean, maybe they start feeling bad at some point and they just like start admitting to everything, or they can't even remember the faces and they believe they did it but they haven't actually. So
there's like a sense, maybe there's a sense with these people, despite the horrible things that they do, that there's a debt that needs to be paid and no one has come to them with the invoice. No one's asked them to pay that debt. So then when something like this comes that really needs to be paid, or society seems to at least focus on it in a way where it seems especially important. So, sad as it is, John Benet or Etan or someone like that suddenly becomes a lot more important in the public eye and media. This person's like, oh, well, maybe I can, make good on some of my damage by taking the hit. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate because this guy, it clouds the water though. If you're after the truth, and if that's what you're, not just punishing somebody, but you're after what really happened and resolving the case, it really makes things shitty because it's
exactly
in the case of someone like this, like now you're actually dependent on this own guy's lies or not, truths about whether he's guilty or not. And it got to the point where there was a civil case that was prosecuted against him in the early 2000s, and they got the family, Stan and Julie Patz, were awarded a sum of $2 million, which they've never collected because this guy is probably not worth anything, having been in and out of jail for a good chunk of his adult life. I mean,
I'm pretty sure he had nothing to offer, right? At the same time, it would seem to me that Julie and Stanley, right? Yeah, Julie and Stanley Patz, they were sort of, at least it would seem to me that they had, their a good amount of money, right? Especially during like the early 2000s, even up to like recently, they have sold their flat in New York, so they no longer live in this area. I've read somewhere, and they sold their loft apartment in this building for $3.75 million. So almost $4 million. For that real estate asset right there. So money was not important to these people. They seemed like they probably were making a good amount of money, and or at least it would seem to me that way, and money was probably not the main reason to persecute Jose. I believe more what they actually were trying to gain, they were most likely just after the truth, wouldn't you say? Like the truth was more important to them. It would seem that than some money, especially from a person like that. Like who, if you have your God forbid, if you have your own like something happens to a child, by your typical like abuser of kids or something like that, usually they won't have anything to offer to the family. So it's more about the truth, right? So it's more about I guess maybe being able to put a marker against that person's name, and I guess it preventing him from like doing this in the future, right? To like other kids and things like maybe that. Putting a lien against that person in terms of like what other creditors would see, and even eventually suppose there's always the fear that someone like this might somehow profit from the crimes. Certainly that was always the concern with someone like Charles Manson, who seemed to want the attention and then did something, made something happen to get that attention, and then it's like, okay, well, we're not going to let you become a millionaire off of this dummy. Like we're gonna either make it so that you have to pay any money you make back out
to families, or we're going to block you legally from.
And another thing that I'm reading about this guy, Jose, is that he was actually released from prison in 2012, but after his release, he was soon arrested once again because he violated a Megan's Law. So I'm quickly looking at what is the Megan's Law.
Oh yes, so Megan's laws. There's a set of laws, like I mentioned. I think back when we were talking about the John Bonet case, there were like enough of these high-profile murders and assaults and kidnappings of children that they're like, hey, how come we didn't know that this creepo, in the many cases, some creep that got out of jail, and just like this guy was just a repeat offender. Like you could not let him be around children for any amount of time without them trying to, sexually assault them. So what they finally made new rules about where these people, when they come out of prison, it depends on the state. I think there might be some sort of federal legislation, but usually it's on a state level. They have different laws. And the Megan's laws are basically saying that not only do we now have to keep track of you for the rest of your life after you get out of jail on a sexual sort of sexual violation conviction, but we're going to track you on a website. So there's a website in California, for instance. I can look up
the sex offenders, right?
Yeah. I can look up any address in the state, and I can see within a certain distance the pictures, and the crimes of the people involved. So like this guy presumably shows up on a website in, I guess, New York State, and probably says under his name that he's been convicted.
Right. So how exactly do you violate the Megan's Law? Like, do you not go for like a checkup or like?
Yeah. It's a good one. Yeah, it's a perfect one. It's almost like violating your parole or probation. It's like
so it's similar to like probation, right? Like you have you have your own like probation officer who sort of looks, you sort of all for the rest of your life you pretty much need to like report to that person and tell them like what you're doing. So it was probably the case that he had done some. I'm not sure, but he most likely started doing some weird stuff once again, and the courts they probably were like, we can't have this guy roaming around, so
it could even be someone else reporting you, like if for whatever reason he's not allowed to be anywhere near children or near a school. I'll give you an example. There's somebody I know of who's in my state's database. It's somebody that was at my school a long time ago, and I found out he was convicted of some problematic crime since then. So one time, about 10-12 years ago, I was at the mall and I was near a video game store, a GameStop, and I saw this guy near it, and I reported him to, I don't know if anything happened to it, but I called the number on the website and I'm like, look, this guy's got this X and X conviction, and I saw him, near a place that has a bunch of children, and I know he likes video games and stuff, but I don't think he's supposed to be there.
Shit. So that would mean that these people can't even go to like video game, like
potentially
anywhere where like kids. So for say you're a video gamer or something like that could really mess up your whole situation, right? I mean, you could get them online, but still, right?
Yeah, like 10-15 years ago, before everything was in the cloud.
Right,
yeah, it was more problematic, but that's what you pay. That's the price you pay for violating.
I mean, it's not like not like I'm feeling bad for these.
It's not
people,
a victim.
Right?
Yeah. It's just, it's unfortunate because you do have legitimate civil liberty concerns. So
exactly. Right, and moving along with the story, right? So this guy, up until 2012, this guy was the main suspect in terms of the disappearance of Etan Patz, even though he never admitted of doing anything to Etan, just admitting that he was 90% sure that he raped a boy, who looked a lot like Etan did back in the day, but he couldn't really he denied his involvement in the murder or the disappearance of Etan. He stated that he set that little boy on a subway. For all we know, he may have not even raped anyone on that day. He was just sort of, he was trying to rape some kids every other day, so he probably lost count of the days. It seemed like for a guy that looks like this, looked like this back in the day, or like this, it would seem that it was not a big deal, to do something like that. So he probably right. So he probably lost like his track of time, and right.
Victims.
So
I mean, the fact is, and the other thing is, I mean, kids kind of look similar at that age. Like Etan doesn't look that much different than like even my own pictures at that age. Your face changes so much when you get older.
Right.
This guy for whatever wits he's able to collect and recollect. Yeah, he may have just, like you said, just lost track of his victims.
Exactly. And then right, and then on 2012, another man named Antonio Ramos, who is this guy right here, an innocent man for all we know, Jose Lopez, reached out to investigators. He believed that Hernandez, Pedro Hernandez, Lopez's brother-in-law, was in fact responsible for Etan's disappearance. Statements by Hernandez's sister Nina Hernandez and Thomas Rivera, leader of a charismatic Christian group at St. Anthony of Padua, basically a Roman Catholic church, indicated that Pedro Hernandez may have publicly confessed in the presence of fellow parishioners in the early 80s to murdering Etan. So basically all of these people started coming up in 2002 accusing this man right here, Pedro Hernandez, of actually killing and kidnapping Etan. All over the place people started. So this is where the story gets really interesting, right?
Yeah, it gets interesting. It gets disturbing. It's one of those things where it's like you want to make sure you hope that people are right, because you don't want to see somebody get punished for something they didn't do, and it's still disturbingly we don't have a lot of actual evidence. So it looks like before they actually arraigned him, the police had gotten word from, like you said, this guy Jose Lopez, who was a member of a church, and people when they go to confess their sins and clear their soul, sometimes they blurt out some things that are kind of hard to forgive. So it sounds like everybody remembered this one time this guy in church talked about killing a kid, and it got to the point where years and years later, I mean, this is so many years later, because he would have,
it was like 22 years
20
later.
Yeah. I mean, apparently he made the confession in church in the 80s, and everybody just sat on it. I guess they were in a more forgiving mood.
32 years, my bad. Like, it was in 2012, not 2002, so it was like 32 years later. So all of the family members and basically the church, the people who were in that small people of church goers, they basically kept that secret for 32 years. And I've read somewhere that Jose Lopez actually the only reason he sort of came out with this information about Pedro Hernandez was the fact that he actually saw a news report about Etan. So on 2012 he actually saw a news report, and he was like, wait, didn't Pedro admit to killing this boy all the way back in the to 1980, right? So that's what happened. So initially Pedro Hernandez, this man right here, he denied his involvement, right? So that was his I've messed up. He initially like, this is really weird to me. Like, this situation, I couldn't even grasp everything right here. Like, this guy was, at first he was confessing, then denying, then confessing, then eventually denying once again. So on 2012 he basically confesses, right? So he states this confession. There's a footage of this confession. I have the footage, but it's really bad quality and you can't really make anything out of it, right? So I'm not gonna play it right now, but then after a while he talks to his lawyers and stuff like that, and they sort of advise him to basically they tell him like, because allegedly this man wasn't really smart, he had like a 70 IQ or something like that, so I'm not sure like how factual that information is, but
Yeah.
right.
So like just to jump in for a second.
Yeah,
So
of course.
it's frustrating because so this is just my little critique of the American justice system, and I think there's equal arguments to be made on the other side. So there's definitely a counterpoint what I'm about to say. But I think what's frustrating to me is not necessarily in this case, but you'll have other cases where people are obviously guilty, like they were caught on camera. The evidence is overwhelming, and the defense attorneys doing their job under, I guess, what we consider to be the defense attorney's job here in America, will just throw up every objection they can. They will almost never let their client plead guilty, at least not until the client is able to get some kind of leverage by doing so over, let's say, the resulting sentence. It's very rare that once in a while you have a defendant who is feels so badly about what has happened that they just insist on taking the rap and on accepting full punishment and just paying their price for society. It's very rare. It's very rare you find a decent criminal, I guess. This is the way I'm saying.
Yeah,
but
like
but this,
right. So doesn't that make it so weird that the fact that this guy like straight up just confessed, right?
well, yeah. So to me, it matches the pattern. Is you have somebody that maybe did something, and something. If he didn't do this, maybe he has something else. So for whatever reason, has something weighing very heavily in his conscience. It blurted it out in front of other people, and then because of like other people getting the police involved, finally he's at the point where he's sitting in front of a police detective, and it all comes flowing out. And then all of a sudden, now you have the legal issues that get in the way of that, and that's kind of what I'm beating the drum about is like, so one of the legal issues is like, they do this very often. They'll have a defendant and they'll say, oh, guess what? His mental IQ is so low that he is, pretty much either mentally handicapped or, borderline, mentally handicapped and for whatever, which is always fascinating because I'm like, how could somebody with an IQ of 70 even navigate through the world so long, and do some of these other things? I have my wife, her brother has Down syndrome, and I would say his IQ is probably between 50 and 70. He can't count. He can't do many things, and his rationing ability is not there. There's other aspects of his personality that are there, but he can't really function in many ways in his life. So I always wonder when they throw that up, that just seems to me to be like a lie. They found
it definitely seemed like a lie, right? But another thing. I'm actually gonna be showing a little clip from his 2004 confession. So, by the way, all of these confessions, like I have lost track because all I can say that this man is right now convicted. He's serving a life sentence in prison. So in 2017, 5 years later, they eventually convicted him of murdering Etan Patz, but I don't believe there was any sort of rape accusations, just a murder, a strangulation murder. We'll get into that, a little bit later. But firstly, I just want to play his second confession video where we have better audio and just for our viewers to like sort of get a sense of who this guy was, because even the way he talked is a little bit weird. So. Who's to say what actually happened? So I'll just quickly play his confession in 2014.
And Etan Patz, was he ever around the store at another time?
I never seen that kid in my life.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You were working at the store for how long before this happened?
What happened?
Before this incident happened that brought us here today.
I think I was working there for a year, something like that. I'm not sure. A year, 2 years.
And Etan Patz never came into the store.
I never seen him.
You never saw him in the store. Or you never saw him.
Never
period.
seen him in the store. Never seen him before.
You had never seen him before.
Never.
Mm-hmm. When you did see him, how long was he standing there before you approached him?
5 minutes.
And Were you watching him? Or were you going up and down the stairs? What were you doing during these 5 minutes?
I went to the store, put the sodas in the store, come back out. And I stand in front of the store, and there he was, in the front of the store.
Mm-hmm.
Then I approached him and I asked him if he wanted something to drink.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't answer me. He nodded his head. I went down to the basement, he followed me to the basement. And whatever happened there, I choked him. It was something that just happened like quick. I don't know why I did it. I don't know why it happened.
As you talk about it, are you surprised?
I don't even know if it happened. I never saw his face.
So, when you went down into the basement with him, you didn't go into the store with him. You went down to the basement with him, and he followed you, or
He followed me.
you said, "Come down to the basement with
No,
me."
he followed me.
And where were you going to get the soda from?
In the basement. There was a fridge in the basement.
Mm-hmm. So he went down the stairs, and he was behind you. Is that right?
He was behind me.
Mm-hmm.
Then he went in front of me. I stood behind him,
Mm-hmm.
and I choked him. Then when I choked him, I started shaking. And there was a plastic bag and a box. Where did it came from? I do not know. It was there. So I put him inside the bag. Then I tied the bag with the same bag. I put him inside the box. It was like a banana box, something, I don't remember. What kind of box was it? It was a cardboard box. I put him up on my shoulder. I carried him out of the store, out to like a block away, a block and a half, away from the store. There was people following me from the basement. All the people that were there at the same time when he was there. They followed me out. I put him like a block and a half away. I set him up on the basement, in the hallway. And I walked back to the store, and I started working just like nothing.
And so when you walked a block and a half away, was it east or west, or towards which street? Towards West Broadway?
I was living
towards
in West Broadway,
Mm-hmm.
so I went down to the right of the store. I don't know if that was east, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Or north, I don't know. I was in West Broadway. Probably went down east, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Before I put him in the bag, I threw the bag, his book bag, over the freezer. It went behind the freezer.
But you did that before you put him in the bag?
Yeah, I didn't put the book bag. I did not put it in the bag, in the box. Why? I don't know. I just grabbed it and threw it over there like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just put him inside the bag, the box.
Did you try to take his clothes off?
No,
Did he try to walk out when you grabbed him?
no. At the box
Mm-hmm.
to see if the box was there, but it was not there. It was gone. Somebody must have removed it from there. I don't know if they put it in the garbage. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know if he left. I don't know if he's still alive. He might be alive because he was still alive in the box.
Right. So, are you here with us right now, Glenn?
Yep.
Yeah, so basically, just to quickly, reiterate the main points of that confession. So, to me, the confession seemed a little bit off. Like, it almost seemed that, he was. I could sort of see the point that some people are getting at, that he was almost forced to confess, because some of the research that I've done, his first confession actually came after like 7 hours of intense interrogation. So, but I guess that's typical, right? That's what they always do. Another thing that basically this man Hernandez. Pedro Hernandez mentioned is that he basically once Etan came into the store where he used to work, he basically sort of led Etan to the basement where there was a fridge, so that he could take the soda out of the fridge and give it to Etan. But he just out of nowhere sort of strangled Etan for no reason. He says that he didn't know why he did it. He didn't rape him. He didn't remove his clothes, so there wasn't any like sexual assault here. He just sort of alleged to kill him, just kill him, I guess. And he was 18 years of age at the time. His lawyers also stated that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Right, so but that could also be a lie. So there were, just basically defensive, I guess, tools in this man's defense, and so that's pretty much it. But the only, I guess, really interesting fact that sort of makes this whole confession seem off is Etan had a school bag, right? So he had a school bag at the time, and basically this man sort of states that he took the school bag and he threw it somewhere around over the corner in the convenience store, and he only took Etan's body, put it in some sort of a bag, and then thrown it to the garbage bin. So that's his explanation of how he got rid of the body. But then he states that the school bag sort of was left somewhere in the corner of the store, and someone must have like thrown it out without like double checking who the school bag owner was. I mean, I guess that would make sense. Maybe the owner of the convenience store thought, some kid left his school bag here, I'll just throw it out. Yeah, but then again, it really doesn't make sense, because you would probably double check what actually happened and who the school bag belonged to. So this is like a strange confession. And another thing to mention here is that it's literally impossible to keep track in this case. When he's denying it, when he's confessing it in 2012, denying it in 2012 and 2013, confessing again in 2014, denying it in 2015. I personally cannot keep track, but eventually in 2017 he gets sentenced to life in prison, right? So on April 18th, 2017. And just to give our audience a quick just to paint, I guess, a clearer picture, Hernandez worked allegedly in this store right here. So Etan, when he left his home from this apartment building, he had like $1 because his parents gave him $1. Back in the day, $1 meant a lot more than it does right now. So he also, I believe he has mentioned to his parents, Etan, before leaving the house, that he was going to buy a soda. So that sort of makes sense. He probably went to the nearest convenience store along the way to the bus stop, and right, it would make sense that so I'm still leaning towards that Pedro Hernandez actually murdered Etan Patz, but I'm not 100% sure, just because of that confession video. And the first confession video also seems off, but I didn't want to play it right now because it's even longer, and the audio quality is so horrible you can't even make anything out. So yeah, so that's my take on it. What is your take on what actually happened?
Yeah, I mean the so I'm reading here. It was a schizotypical disorder, which I'm just trying to figure out the difference between that and schizophrenia. It looks like there's some kind of minor difference, but I think for the purposes of our conversation, let's consider them mostly the same. So, unfortunately, it's the kind of disorder that makes anything that comes out of his mouth particularly suspect. So you don't really know what the truth is, because the fact is, when they were going through the legal wrangling in this case, one of the things that came up was, oh, you didn't advise him of his rights, or did you advise him of his rights? Because we have rights in America for like when the police can ask you to say something and when you can ask for a lawyer, and then they can't ask you any more questions.
I just want to quickly interrupt. This is you have the rights to remain silent, like that. Well known line. But that's actually a law. That's the Miranda law, right?
It comes out of a case where somebody wasn't advised of their rights, and they kind of formally codified it. So before a certain period in U.S. history, that wasn't the case. The police could use a lot of dirty tricks, but now people know that there's certain things you can ask for according to the Supreme Court before they keep going. So the problem is, if you're crazy, you may not even be able to give permission for things. So if they decide that you're mentally if you're mentally interpreting reality in such a way that you're not accurately interpreting what's going on, if you think it's like the Cookie Monster telling you your Miranda rights, well, that's not a police officer anymore, so you don't really know what you're confessing to who. So that's kind of the argument. So it cuts both ways, because it could also explain why he did what he did, if he actually did it. So that's, I think, as we kind of finish off this episode, going back to the stranger danger topic. And, what is really scary for a parent is, look, like, Etan did everything right. He, they gave him money, so it was like a big boy. He could buy his own soda. And like you said, $1 could buy you a lot back in 1978, buy you a couple sodas. So he went, he goes to the store, and like, who expects the store clerk to lose their mind and strangle your little boy? It doesn't make sense. It seems like an impossible thing, yet if we were to believe what the court found and convicted him on, and they convicted him on no body, just his own confession. Poor Etan's remains, if he's dead, are still out there, under a landfill or at the bottom of the ocean somewhere when the trash gets dumped out. Amazing to think that, like, that fast. This, I don't know if I would call him a vulture, because he says it was kind of an involuntary act. So, maybe it is. So here's something to point out is, if he was 18 and working in that bodega, that is about the age where things like schizophrenia start to emerge in a lot of the population. So case in point, once again, another recent example within the past year, I want to say, or 2 years, there was this was caught on video. And once again, it was someone right around that same age, an 18-year-old guy in New York City walking down the street. And there's an old man, like a man in his 80s or 90s, walking, down the sidewalk. And he starts this 18-year-old kid starts hitting and beating this old man with a stick and with his fists. And, of course, everybody around him is instantly enraged and surprised. And, they start chasing him down the street. They actually caught him. But I think he got away, but then his family turned him in later. And he actually, like, this is a case I followed for the past couple of years. This guy actually, he was pretty much found not guilty. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. They figured out he's a schizophrenic. He's on medication now, and basically he's released for home watch. But it's like one of those things. It's like, on one hand, you might want to blame the family of someone like that, to be like, hey, didn't you notice your relative was like starting to say crazy stuff and do things and maybe act erratic? But we have laws that give people a lot of freedom, sometimes too much freedom. That's where a lot of our homeless come from, are people that used to be institutionalized, and now there's not the funding for it, as well as there's a lot of like personal rights laws. But in this case, it's like, look, like, this guy maybe was an accident waiting to happen, and we don't know to what extent those around him saw that and were in denial about it, or whether, like he says,
for over 30 years, by the way. So, who knows what, this
what's
man,
going on,
right, what other things this guy has done. Gosh. Right. But, from like from the interviews and from the confessions, when Pedro was actually talking, he doesn't seem like he's an evil person. He definitely seems like he's not happy about the whole, when he's describing what he did to Etan, he doesn't seem happy. So it was probably a case of remorse for him. He definitely felt sad about it, like I could tell from his voice. So right, maybe it is a case where you have a guy who is, literally crazy and can't help the fact that he's crazy, and he has these like moments of insanity where he could actually kill a 6-year-old child, right? So I mean, yeah, pretty much. So I guess in closing, my thoughts are that I'm pretty much sure that this guy did it. You know what I'm saying? But just because of the fact that the video confession sounded a little bit off, and the fact that you have also this guy, looking really interesting right here in these pictures. And sort of admitting to raping a boy who he was 90% certain looked like Etan on the same day when Etan went missing. I mean, it's either Pedro or this guy Jose, but then in that case Jose is not completely telling the truth, and he probably, if he did rape Etan, he most likely also killed him at the same time. So yeah, so maybe that's the situation. So I'm leaning towards Pedro, but also I'm not completely disregarding Jose as well. So I guess what is your take on this whole case?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm even more like, I'm so befuddled by these like different confessions and the unreliability of the witnesses, and then we don't have a body, we don't have physical evidence. In fact, it sounds like they excavated the basement of one of the buildings nearby, which may have been where the bodega was, but they never did find Aiden's body. So, even the cops had hoped that maybe they could find something. Whoever did it, I guess the thing is, for me, this cements in my mind that stranger danger is real. So it's funny that there's so much criticism and, stranger danger, overblown. In my mind, this is like exactly the example, just like the other ones I mentioned in this case, where it's like, yeah, you know what? It's not worth the risk. It's like, I would rather have my kid be a little more paranoid about strangers, and I certainly do my share of propaganda around that. But yeah, I mean, just because look at exactly what could happen is you trust your kid to go to a safe business or whatever happened, and between like maybe a 200-yard stretch, like a hawk snatching up a baby chick that got loose from the pen. I mean, you know what I mean? Like the instant this kid was vulnerable, someone pounced, whoever it was. Exactly. And that I think is enough as a parent. That's a lesson as a parent that, don't listen to people telling you 1 in 10,000 or whatever it is. You don't want to be that 1 in 10,000. That 1 in 10,000 will ruin your life and your child's life. So yeah, just watch out.
Take precautions, right? Take precautions. Yeah. Do your, I guess, due diligence. Right. So, exactly. So we have been rolling for like over an hour and 10. So I'm assuming we're gonna be cutting the podcast at around this point. So I guess right. So yeah, it's at this point. I'm not certain who actually is responsible for the disappearance of Etan. Yeah, so anything you want to, mention to our audience before we sign out?
No, that's it. We look forward to your comments on the videos. Please subscribe. As always, we appreciate seeing the subscription numbers go up. And we're really looking forward to any kind of debate, because I really would like to see what other parents or other listeners think about whether I'm being a little too paranoid with the stranger danger thing. It's pretty controversial, but cases like this really stick out in my mind, where it's like, wow, it's just not worth the risk as much as you would want to enable your child at a younger age.
Exactly. So this has been the Solvable Mysteries Podcast, episode number 12. So yeah, guys, don't forget to leave a comment down below if you have some sort of theories, or if we missed any important details, which I'm sure we have missed some sort of important details, because this case has been so widely reported. There's some probably additional information that we have not covered. And yeah, I guess that's it from us for this episode. Definitely catch us on episode 13, and for now, guys, stay safe and peace out.